Imagine discovering that your entire life was built on a lie, that your family's poverty, the struggles you faced, the hard work that defined each day, all of it wasn't the result of fate or bad luck, but rather a calculated betrayal by people you respected and served. That's exactly what happened to Amanda Foster, a laundress who for over 20 years cleaned the clothes of the most powerful families in a small Tennessee town, never suspecting that these same families had stolen her own family's future decades earlier. The farce of her simple, honest life was about to be destroyed by a discovery that would change not only her destiny, but that of an entire community that had lived under the weight of monumental injustice. What she would find hidden among the dirty clothes of a deceased client would reveal a conspiracy so deep and cruel that it would challenge everything she believed about justice, power, and human nature. For years, Amanda accepted her position in life as something natural. She was the woman who washed the clothes of the rich, who entered through back doors, who remained invisible while caring for the intimate belongings of people who lived in mansions built on land that once belonged to her family. She had grown up hearing vague stories about how her grandparents lost their properties due to poor financial management, and never questioned this narrative because questioning the past didn't pay present bills. But sometimes the universe has other plans for us, and truth has a peculiar way of emerging when we least expect it. On a seemingly ordinary morning, while sorting the dirty laundry of the deceased matriarch of the Hartwell family, Amanda found something that shouldn't have been there: an old diary containing secrets capable of destroying reputations, exposing crimes, and revealing that the corruption she thought was a thing of the past was still alive and protecting the guilty. What began as another day of routine work would transform into the beginning of a journey that would test her courage, threaten her safety, and finally reveal a truth that had been buried for over 60 years. The yellowed pages of that diary contained more than personal memories. They documented a meticulously planned conspiracy that had stolen land, destroyed families, and transferred wealth from honest workers to well-connected criminals who used their positions of power to cover up their crimes. Amanda discovered that her family hadn't failed. They had been victims of a lie so well constructed that even the victims themselves believed it. Corrupt judges, forged documents, veiled threats, and a network of complicity that extended through all the town's institutions. All of this was recorded in the elegant handwriting of a woman who never imagined her confessions would be read by the daughter of one of her victims. But knowing the truth is only the first step. Doing something about it when you're facing families who control banks, courts, and even the local media is a completely different battle. Amanda would have to choose between the safety of ignorance and the danger of justice, knowing that once she decided to fight, there would be no turning back, because some truths are too big to be silenced, even when revealing those truths might cost everything you've built in life. What Amanda didn't know was that her discovery would trigger a series of events that would expose not only the crimes of the past, but also the corruption of the present, revealing how power really works in small towns where the same families have controlled everything for generations. Her journey would take her from the shadows of invisibility to the center of a national battle against historical injustice, transforming a silent laundress into a symbol of courage for all those who ever felt the system was working against them. She would face threats, blackmail, social isolation, and the systematic attempt to destroy her life, but she would also discover unexpected allies, forces she never knew existed, and most importantly, a truth that had been preserved by someone who understood that one day justice would finally be possible. The betrayal that defined her family for decades was about to be exposed, but the price of that exposure would be greater than Amanda ever imagined, and the reward would be even greater than her boldest dreams could conceive. You know how some stories start with a bang, but the most powerful ones? They begin in the quiet corners of everyday life. That's exactly where we find Amanda Foster, a woman who's been washing other people's clothes for over 20 years in a small Tennessee town where everybody knows everybody's business. She's the kind of person you'd pass on the street without a second glance, not because she's unremarkable, but because she's mastered the art of blending into the background. Her hands tell the story of decades spent scrubbing away the stains of the wealthy, while her own family's past remained mysteriously stained with what she believed was simply bad luck. Amanda had built her entire identity around being the honest, hardworking widow who never asked questions and never caused trouble. But sometimes, my friend, it's the people who don't ask questions who end up uncovering the biggest lies. Her routine was as predictable as sunrise. Wake up at dawn, sort the laundry, make her rounds to the big houses, and return home to her modest apartment where she'd raised 2 children who were now adults with their own complicated lives. She'd convinced herself that this simple existence was enough, that the stories her grandmother told about losing their family land were just old wounds that time should heal. Little did she know that some wounds aren't meant to heal, they're meant to reveal the truth. The Hartwell mansion sat on Magnolia Street like a monument to old Southern money, its white columns gleaming in the morning sun as Amanda approached with her weekly delivery. She'd been servicing this account for nearly 15 years, ever since old Mrs. Catherine Hartwell had hired her after seeing her work at the Methodist Church fundraiser. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, a foster, washing the clothes of people who lived in houses that could have been built on land her family once owned. But Amanda had learned long ago not to dwell on such thoughts. They led nowhere good, and certainly didn't pay the bills. The current generation of Hartwells treated her with the kind of polite distance that wealthy folks reserve for the help. Not unkind, but never quite seeing her as fully human either. She'd perfected the art of being invisible, moving through their lives like a ghost who left everything cleaner than she found it. What she didn't realize was that this invisibility would soon become her greatest asset in uncovering a deception that had been hiding in plain sight for decades. The mansion's grandeur had always made her feel small, but today, something felt different, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what. Maybe it was the way the morning light hit the windows, or maybe it was simply that after 20 years of accepting her place in the world, something deep inside was finally ready to question why that place had been chosen for her. Amanda's story with the Hartwell family went back further than most people knew, though she herself was unaware of just how deep those roots ran. Her grandmother, Helen Foster, had always spoken in hushed tones about the old days, when their family owned significant property in the county, but those stories had the hazy quality of fairy tales to young Amanda. According to family lore, her great-grandfather had been a successful farmer who'd lost everything in what Helen vaguely described as bad business dealings sometime in the 1960s. The details were always fuzzy, and whenever Amanda pressed for specifics, her grandmother would change the subject or claim her memory wasn't what it used to be. Growing up poor had taught Amanda to focus on moving forward rather than looking back, so she'd eventually stopped asking questions about their family's fall from grace. She'd built her identity around being a survivor, someone who could make something from nothing, and who didn't need handouts or explanations. But there's something about washing other people's intimate belongings that gives you insights into their lives, and over the years, Amanda had noticed things about the Hartwells that didn't quite add up. They had old documents and photographs scattered around their house that sometimes featured properties she didn't recognize, and occasionally, she'd overhear phone conversations about the old acquisitions that made her wonder what exactly they'd acquired and from whom. The town of Millbrook, Tennessee was the kind of place where secrets had a way of becoming family heirlooms, passed down through generations like antique furniture that nobody really wants but nobody dares to throw away. Amanda had grown up hearing whispers about this family or that family, about deals made in back rooms and handshakes that changed everything for some folks while leaving others with nothing. She'd always assumed these were just the usual small-town gossip, the kind of stories that grow more dramatic with each telling, until they bear little resemblance to whatever truth might have started them. But as she'd gotten older and started paying closer attention to the dynamics of power in their little community, she'd begun to notice patterns that made her uncomfortable. The same families seemed to always come out on top, while families like hers seemed destined to serve them in one capacity or another. It wasn't that she believed in conspiracy theories or thought there was some grand plot against poor folks. She was too practical for that kind of thinking, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there were stories beneath the stories, truths that had been buried so deep that even the people living on top of them had forgotten they were there. What she didn't know was that some truths have a way of surfacing when you least expect them, usually when you're just trying to do your job and mind your own business. Working as a laundress had given Amanda a unique perspective on the lives of Millbrook's elite. She saw their stains, their secrets, their humanity in ways that their public personas never revealed. She'd learned to read the signs, the wine stains that told stories of lonely evenings, the grass stains that spoke of affairs conducted in inappropriate places, the tears in expensive fabric that revealed the cracks in perfect facades. Over the years, she'd developed a kind of professional blindness to these revelations, understanding instinctively that her job security depended on seeing everything and remembering nothing. But lately, something had been shifting in her perspective, maybe because her own children were now adults facing their own struggles with money and opportunity in a town where both seemed reserved for certain families. She'd started noticing how the same names appeared on every important committee, every board of directors, every list of property owners that mattered. The Hartwells, the Caldwells, the Montgomerys. These families seemed to have their fingers in every pie, their influence extending into every corner of local government and business. Amanda had always told herself that this was just how small towns worked, that success bred success, and it wasn't her place to question the natural order of things. But watching her son David struggle to find decent work while the Hartwell boy got handed a management position at the bank fresh out of college had started to crack her acceptance of that natural order. The morning routine routine that had defined Amanda's life for 2 decades was about to be shattered in ways she couldn't imagine, though she approached the Hartwell mansion that Tuesday with the same quiet efficiency that had made her invisible for so long. She'd perfected the art of entering through the service entrance, collecting the laundry from the designated areas, and leaving without disturbing the family's daily rhythm. Mrs. Catherine Hartwell had passed away 6 months earlier, and the house had that peculiar emptiness that comes when the person who gave a place its personality is no longer there to animate it. Benjamin Hartwell, Catherine's son, had kept Amanda on to maintain the household linens, though she suspected it was more out of habit than any real need for her services. The house felt different now, less carefully curated, with personal items scattered in places where Catherine would never have allowed them. It was during one of these collections that Amanda's life would take a turn that would challenge everything she thought she knew about her family, her town, and the very foundations of the life she'd built on what she believed was simply bad luck and hard work. Sometimes the most profound changes come disguised as the most ordinary moments, and this Tuesday morning would prove to be one of those pivotal points where the past and present collide in ways that can never be undone. As Amanda sorted through the laundry in the Hartwells' utility room, she couldn't have known that she was about to stumble upon a thread that, when pulled, would unravel decades of carefully constructed lies and reveal a web of corruption that had shaped not just her family's fate but the entire power structure of their small town. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the expensive fabric she handled with the same care she'd shown for 20 years, never suspecting that among these routine items lay the key to understanding why her family had fallen so far and why certain other families had risen so high. She moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had long ago made peace with her place in the world, not knowing that this peace was about to be shattered by a discovery that would force her to question everything she'd accepted as simply the way things were. The silence of the empty mansion seemed to whisper with secrets, and though Amanda couldn't hear them yet, she was about to become fluent in their language. What she would find that morning would transform her from a woman who cleaned up other people's messes into someone determined to expose the biggest mess of all, a conspiracy of greed and betrayal that had been hiding in plain sight for decades, protected by the very invisibility that had defined her own existence. You know that moment when your whole world shifts, but it starts with something so small you almost miss it entirely? That's exactly what happened to Amanda Foster on what should have been just another routine Tuesday morning at the Hartwell mansion. She was going through the motions she'd perfected over 15 years, sorting the delicates from the regular wash, checking pockets for forgotten items, treating stains with the kind of methodical care that had built her reputation. But tucked between the folds of an old silk blouse that had belonged to Catherine Hartwell, Amanda's fingers brushed against something that shouldn't have been there, the worn leather binding of what appeared to be a small journal. Her first instinct was to set it aside and pretend she hadn't seen it, because 20 years of working for wealthy families had taught her that curiosity was a luxury she couldn't afford. But something about the way the morning light caught the faded gold initials on the cover made her pause, and in that pause, the trajectory of her entire life shifted. The journal felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried the weight of secrets that had been waiting decades to be discovered. Amanda's hands trembled slightly as she realized she was holding something that Catherine Hartwell had obviously never intended for anyone else to see, something that had been hidden away until death had loosened its keeper's grip on the truth. The smart thing would have been to place the diary back where she found it and walk away, but Amanda had never been one to take the easy path when her instincts told her something important was at stake. She glanced around the empty utility room, listening for any sounds that might indicate Benjamin Hartwell was home, but the house maintained its tomb-like silence. Her heart was beating faster than it should have been for such a simple decision, but something deep in her gut was telling her that this wasn't just any old diary. This was a door to answers she'd been unconsciously seeking her entire life. The leather was soft with age, and as she carefully opened the cover, she could smell the faint scent of Catherine's perfume still clinging to the pages, as if the woman's presence was somehow guiding Amanda toward a truth that had been buried for far too long. The handwriting was elegant but hurried in places, the kind of script that suggested someone writing down thoughts they needed to remember, but hoped others would never read. Amanda's eyes scanned the first few entries, which seemed to be routine observations about social events and family matters, but as she flipped deeper into the journal, the tone began to change in ways that made her stomach clench with a mixture of anticipation and dread. She could feel that she was approaching something significant, something that would explain the nagging feeling she'd carried for years that there were pieces of her family's story that didn't quite fit together. The farce of her simple life was about to be exposed, though she didn't yet understand what role she'd been unknowingly playing in someone else's carefully orchestrated deception. As Amanda's eyes moved across the pages, she began to see dates from the 1960s, and her breath caught when she realized These entries corresponded to the same time period her grandmother had always been so vague about, the years when their family had supposedly lost everything due to bad business dealings. The handwriting became more animated as Catherine described what she called the land acquisition project, and Amanda felt a chill run down her spine as she read phrases like, "The Foster property will be perfect for our expansion," and "Judge Caldwell assures us the documentation can be handled discreetly." Her hands were shaking now as she realized she was reading about her own family, about events that had shaped her entire existence, written from the perspective of people who had apparently orchestrated those events. The casual tone Catherine used to describe what were obviously illegal activities made Amanda feel sick. These weren't the writings of someone wrestling with moral dilemmas, but rather the planning notes of someone who saw other people's lives as obstacles to be removed. She read about meetings held in the back room of the bank, about documents that needed to be adjusted, about the importance of making sure the Foster family never suspects what really happened. The corruption was laid out in black and white, written in the elegant script of a woman who clearly never imagined these words would be read by one of the victims of her family's schemes. Amanda realized she was holding evidence of a conspiracy that had destroyed her family's legacy and condemned generations of Fosters to lives of struggle and service, all so that families like the Hartwells could build their empires on stolen foundations. The most devastating entry came about halfway through the journal, dated September 15, 1963, where Catherine wrote with obvious satisfaction about the successful completion of the Foster acquisition. Amanda read with growing horror as Catherine described how they had used forged documents to claim that Amanda's great-grandfather owed massive debts to local businesses, debts that had never actually existed, but which provided legal justification for seizing his property. The entry detailed how Judge Caldwell had been paid to expedite the foreclosure proceedings, and how Sheriff Montgomery had been instructed to ensure that any protests from the Foster family were quickly and quietly suppressed. Catherine wrote about the celebration dinner they'd held at the country club, toasting their success while Amanda's great-grandfather was probably sitting in his empty house, wondering how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. The casual cruelty of it all was breathtaking. These people had destroyed a family's entire future and then celebrated it as a business victory, never once considering the human cost of their greed. Amanda felt tears of rage building as she read Catherine's observations about how the Foster family took the loss better than expected, and how they seemed to have accepted their new circumstances without causing any trouble. The mentira that had defined her family's understanding of their own history was being stripped away word by word, revealing a truth so ugly that Amanda could barely process it. She realized that every struggle her family had endured, every limitation they'd accepted, every dream they'd abandoned had been built on a foundation of deliberate betrayal by people they'd probably trusted. What made the discovery even more painful was reading Catherine's analysis of how perfectly their plan had worked, how the Foster family had internalized their loss as personal failure rather than recognizing it as theft. Catherine wrote with obvious pride about how they'd managed to convince not just the Fosters, but the entire community that the family's downfall was the result of poor financial decisions and bad luck rather than criminal conspiracy. She described the psychological manipulation they'd employed, spreading rumors about Amanda's great-grandfather's supposed gambling debts and questionable business practices, creating a narrative that made the community blame the victim rather than question the circumstances. The Traysons went beyond just stealing land. They'd stolen her family's reputation, their sense of self-worth, their belief in their own competence and judgment. Amanda realized that the shame her grandmother had always carried about their family's fall from grace wasn't based on any actual failure on their part, but on lies so skillfully constructed that even the victims had believed them. The journal revealed how the conspirators had carefully monitored the Foster family for years afterward, making sure they never got too close to the truth, subtly undermining any attempts they made to rebuild their lives or investigate their past. Reading about her own family being discussed like a problem to be managed made Amanda feel a rage she'd never experienced before, a fury that burned away years of acceptance and resignation and replaced them with a determination to expose the injusticia that had shaped her entire existence. The final entries that Amanda read that morning dealt with Catherine's concerns about maintaining the narrative and ensuring that future generations never questioned the legitimacy of our holdings. She wrote about the importance of keeping certain documents hidden and about the need to maintain good relationships with key families in the legal and law enforcement communities to ensure that questions about past acquisitions never gained traction. Catherine's paranoia was evident in her detailed notes about which families might pose a threat if they ever learned the truth, and Amanda was shocked to see her own family listed among those who needed to be carefully monitored for signs of curiosity about their past. The journal revealed that the Hartwells had been watching the Foster family for decades, ready to intervene if anyone anyone started asking the wrong questions or getting too close to the truth. Amanda realized that her own employment with the Hartwell family might not have been the coincidence she'd always assumed. Perhaps they'd hired her as a way to keep tabs on her, to make sure she remained safely focused on serving them, rather than questioning why she was in a position to need their employment in the first place. The thought that her entire adult life might have been orchestrated by the same people who'd destroyed her family's past was almost too much to bear. But as overwhelming as the truth was, Amanda also felt something she hadn't experienced in years: clarity about why her life had unfolded the way it had, and more importantly, a sense of purpose about what she needed to do next. As Amanda carefully closed the journal and slipped it into her bag, her mind was racing with the implications of what she'd discovered and the impossible decision that now lay before her. She could try to forget what she'd read, continue her quiet life of service, and let sleeping dogs lie. After all, the people who'd committed these crimes were mostly dead, and pursuing justice now would likely destroy the stability she'd worked so hard to build for herself and her children. But she could also choose to honor the memory of her great-grandfather and all the other families who'd been victimized by this conspiracy, even if it meant risking everything she'd built on the foundation of their lies. The weight of the journal in her bag felt like the weight of her family's stolen legacy, and Amanda knew that whatever she decided to do next would determine not just her own future, but whether the truth about Millbrook's power structure would finally see the light of day. She finished collecting the laundry with mechanical efficiency, but her mind was already moving beyond the routine tasks that had defined her life for so long, toward a future that was suddenly full of dangerous possibilities. As she prepared to leave the Hartwell mansion, Amanda realized she was no longer the same woman who'd entered it that morning. She was someone who knew the truth, and that knowledge was going to change everything, whether she was ready for it or not. The question now wasn't whether she could handle the truth, but whether she had the courage to do something about it, knowing that the powerful families who'd built their empires on lies and theft wouldn't hesitate to destroy anyone who threatened to expose them. You know how some people say that once you open Pandora's box, you can't close it again? Well, Amanda Foster was about to learn that lesson the hard way, because the journal she'd discovered had awakened something in her that 20 years of quiet acceptance couldn't put back to sleep. The days following her discovery were torture. She'd go through the motions of her daily routine, washing clothes and making deliveries, but her mind was constantly churning over the implications of what she'd read. Every time she passed the courthouse or saw Judge Caldwell's son at the grocery store, she felt like she was carrying a bomb that could explode at any moment and destroy the carefully constructed peace of their small town. But Amanda had never been one to let sleeping dogs lie when those dogs were guarding secrets that had shaped her entire life. So she made a decision that would change everything. She was going to dig deeper, no matter where that digging led her. The farce of her family's supposed failure had been exposed, but she needed to understand the full scope of what had been done to them and how many other families had suffered the same fate. She started small, telling herself she was just curious, just trying to understand her own history better, but deep down she knew she was preparing for something much bigger than personal enlightenment. The truth has a way of demanding action once you've seen it clearly, and Amanda was about to discover that some truths are too big to carry alone. Her first stop was the Millbrook County Records Office, a dusty building that most people only visited when they needed copies of birth certificates or marriage licenses. Amanda had never set foot in the place before, but she walked in with the kind of nervous determination that comes from knowing you're about to cross a line you can never uncross. The clerk, a middle-aged woman named Betty Sue who'd gone to high school with Amanda's older sister, was happy to help her research her family's property history, assuming it was just genealogical curiosity. But as Amanda requested documents from the 1960s, she began to see patterns that made her stomach turn. Not just her family's property, but several other parcels of valuable land had changed hands during the same time period, all under similar circumstances involving sudden debt claims and rapid foreclosure proceedings. The paperwork looked official enough, but Amanda's untrained eye began to notice inconsistencies in the documentation, signatures that didn't quite match, dates that seemed suspicious, and legal language that appeared to have been added after the original documents were created. Betty Sue, bless her heart, didn't seem to notice anything unusual about Amanda's growing agitation as she photocopied page after page of what were clearly fraudulent documents that had been sitting in official files for decades. The corruption wasn't just about her family. It was a systematic pattern of theft that had reshaped the entire economic landscape of their county, transferring wealth from working families to those who already had power and connections. The more Amanda researched, the more she realized that the conspiracy Catherine Hartwell had described in her journal was even more more extensive than she'd initially understood. The same names kept appearing on document after document: Judge Caldwell authorizing foreclosures, Sheriff Montgomery serving eviction notices, and various members of the Hartwell, Preston, and Montgomery families acquiring properties at suspiciously low prices immediately after the foreclosures. It was like watching a carefully choreographed dance where everyone knew their steps except the families being destroyed by the performance. Amanda started making lists, tracking patterns, and building a timeline that revealed the scope of what could only be described as organized crime disguised as legitimate business dealings. The mentira that had been sold to the community was that these families had simply been better at business, more financially responsible, more deserving of success, but the documents told a different story of systematic fraud that had been protected by corrupt officials and covered up by a network of people who benefited from keeping the truth buried. What made it even more infuriating was realizing how many people in positions of authority had to have known what was happening but chose to look the other way, either because they were being paid off or because they were afraid of challenging such powerful families. The injusticia wasn't just in the original crimes, but in the decades of silence that had allowed the perpetrators to enjoy the fruits of their theft, while their victims struggled in poverty, never knowing why their lives had taken such a devastating turn. Amanda's investigation led her to seek out some of the older residents of Millbrook, people who'd been adults during the 1960s and might remember details that hadn't made it into the official records. What she discovered during these conversations was both heartbreaking and infuriating. Story after story of families who'd lost their land under suspicious circumstances, but who'd been too intimidated or too ashamed to fight back. Mrs. Eleanor Jackson, now in her 80s, told Amanda about how her late husband's family had owned a successful farm until they were suddenly accused of owing massive debts to suppliers they'd never done business with. Mr. Robert Williams described how his father's construction company had been destroyed by false accusations of building code violations that resulted in lawsuits they couldn't afford to fight. Each story followed the same pattern: sudden legal troubles, impossible debts, rapid foreclosure, and acquisition by one of the connected families at a fraction of the property's real value. What made these conversations even more painful was seeing how these elderly residents still carried shame about their family's supposed failures, still believed the lies they'd been told about their loved ones' incompetence or poor judgment. The traceau had been so complete that even the victims had internalized the narrative created by their victimizers, spending decades blaming themselves for circumstances that had been entirely beyond their control. Amanda realized she wasn't just uncovering a historical injustice, she was discovering that the entire social and economic structure of their community had been built on a foundation of lies and theft that continued to shape people's lives decades later. The most shocking revelation came when Amanda decided to visit the local newspaper archives, hoping to find contemporary accounts of the property transfers that might provide additional context for what she'd discovered in the official records. What she found instead was evidence of a cover-up that extended into the media. Stories about the foreclosures that painted the affected families as financially irresponsible, editorials praising the business acumen of families like the Hartwells, and a complete absence of any investigative reporting that might have questioned the circumstances surrounding so many simultaneous property transfers. The newspaper's editor during that time period had been James Caldwell, Judge Caldwell's brother, which explained why the coverage had been so one-sided and why no one had ever questioned the official narrative. Amanda found herself getting angry all over again as she read articles that described her great-grandfather as a failed farmer who couldn't adapt to changing times, when she now knew he'd been the victim of an elaborate fraud. The corruption had been so thorough that it had controlled not just the legal system and law enforcement, but also the flow of information that shaped public opinion about what had happened. Even the historical record had been manipulated to protect the guilty and blame the innocent, ensuring that future generations would never question the legitimacy of the wealth and power that had been built on stolen foundations. The farce had been so complete that it had become accepted truth, repeated and reinforced until even the descendants of the victims believed it. As Amanda's investigation progressed, she began to notice that her questions were attracting attention from people who didn't seem happy about her newfound curiosity regarding local history. Betty Sue at the records office mentioned that she'd received calls asking about Amanda's research, and Mrs. Jackson confided that someone had visited her asking questions about their conversation. The elderly woman seemed frightened, warning Amanda to be careful about stirring up old troubles because some folks don't like having their business examined too closely. Amanda realized that her investigation was no longer a secret and that the descendants of the families who'd benefited from the original conspiracy were aware of her activities and concerned about where they might lead. The weight of what she'd discovered was becoming heavier with each passing day, not just because of the historical injustice it represented, but because of the very real danger it posed to her current life and livelihood. She She was no longer just a laundress researching her family history. She was someone who possessed evidence that could destroy the reputations and possibly the fortunes of some of the most powerful families in the county. The question that kept her awake at night wasn't whether she had enough evidence to prove what had happened, but whether she had the courage to use that evidence, knowing that doing so would make her a target of people who had already proven they were willing to destroy anyone who stood in their way. The turning point came when Amanda realized she couldn't carry this burden alone any longer. The weight of the truth was crushing her, and she needed to make a decision about what to do with the knowledge that was eating away at her peace of mind. She thought about her children, about the life she'd built through hard work and determination, about the risks of challenging people who had the power to destroy everything she'd worked for. But she also thought about her great-grandfather, about all the other families who'd been victimized, about the ongoing injustice of a system that continued to benefit the descendants of thieves, while the descendants of their victims struggled to make ends meet. The mentira that had shaped her entire understanding of her family's place in the world had been stripped away, and she couldn't pretend she didn't know what she now knew. As she sat in her small apartment, surrounded by photocopies of fraudulent documents and notes from her conversations with elderly victims, Amanda realized that she'd reached a crossroads that would define not just her own future, but her children's future, and possibly the future of their entire community. The truth was demanding action, and she was going to have to decide whether she was brave enough to answer that demand, knowing that once she took the next step, there would be no going back to the quiet, invisible life she'd built on the foundation of other people's lies. The corruption she'd uncovered was still alive and well in Millbrook, still protecting itself, still ready to destroy anyone who threatened to expose it, and Amanda Foster was about to find out just how far these people would go to keep their secrets buried. You know that moment when you realize you've been swimming in shallow water your whole life, and suddenly you're in the deep end with sharks circling around you? That's exactly where Amanda Foster found herself when she decided to take her investigation from quiet research to direct confrontation. She'd spent weeks gathering evidence, building her case, and convincing herself that the truth would be enough to protect her, but she was about to learn that truth without power is just another form of vulnerability. Her first mistake was thinking she could approach this like a reasonable conversation between civilized people, when what she was really doing was threatening the foundation of everything these families had built their lives on. The farsa of respectability that surrounded families like the Hartwells was about to be tested, and Amanda was going to discover that people who've spent decades living on stolen wealth don't give it up without a fight. She'd convinced herself that if she just presented the evidence calmly and logically, surely these people would see the need to make things right. But she was about to learn that criminals who've gotten away with their crimes for decades don't suddenly develop consciences just because someone discovers their old paperwork. The corruption she'd uncovered wasn't just a historical curiosity. It was a living, breathing system that was still protecting itself and still willing to destroy anyone who threatened to expose it. What Amanda thought would be a quest for justice was about to become a battle for survival, and she was walking into it armed with nothing but photocopies and righteous indignation. Amanda's first direct confrontation came when she decided to approach Margaret Caldwell, the judge's daughter who now ran the family's real estate business and served on the city council. Amanda had convinced herself that Margaret, being a woman and a mother herself, might be more sympathetic to the human cost of what her father had done. She requested a meeting under the pretense of discussing some property research she was doing, and Margaret agreed to see her at the real estate office on a quiet Thursday afternoon. But the moment Amanda began explaining what she'd discovered about the fraudulent foreclosures of the 1960s, Margaret's demeanor shifted from polite interest to cold hostility. "I think you're mistaken about what you think you've found," Margaret said, her voice taking on the kind of steel that comes from generations of wielding power over people like Amanda. "My father was a respected judge who served this community with integrity for over 30 years, and I won't sit here and listen to wild accusations based on your misinterpretation of old documents." The dismissal was swift and brutal, but what came next was worse. Margaret's thinly veiled threats about the dangers of spreading false rumors and how people who make unfounded accusations often find themselves facing serious legal consequences. Amanda left that meeting shaking, not just from anger, but from the realization that she was dealing with people who saw her not as a fellow human being seeking justice, but as a threat to be neutralized by any means necessary. The mentira that these families were somehow more honorable or deserving than others was crumbling before her eyes, revealing the ugly truth of how power really works in small towns. The pressure escalated quickly after Amanda's meeting with Margaret Caldwell, and it became clear that word of her investigation had spread through the network of connected families faster than she'd anticipated. Within Within days, she started receiving subtle but unmistakable messages that her questions were unwelcome and that continuing her research would have consequences. Her longtime client, Mrs. Peterson, suddenly decided she no longer needed laundry services, citing budget concerns that Amanda knew were fabricated. The manager at the local bank where Amanda had done business for 15 years called to inform her that they were reviewing her accounts and might need to adjust her credit arrangements. Even her landlord, who'd never given her any trouble in the 8 years she'd lived in her apartment, mentioned that he'd received complaints about noise and might need to reconsider her lease. The Tresson was breathtaking in its coordination. These people were systematically dismantling her life as punishment for daring to question their version of history. What made it even more infuriating was how they maintained their facade of respectability while destroying her livelihood, acting as if these coincidences were just unfortunate business decisions rather than deliberate retaliation. Amanda realized she was experiencing firsthand the same kind of coordinated attack that had probably been used against her great-grandfather and the other families who'd been victimized in the 1960s. The system that had protected the original conspiracy was still alive and well, still capable of crushing anyone who threatened to expose the truth. The most devastating blow came when Benjamin Hartwell himself requested a meeting with Amanda, ostensibly to discuss her continued employment with his family. She agreed to meet him at his office, hoping that perhaps he might be different from the others, that maybe he'd be willing to acknowledge what his family had done and work towards some kind of resolution. But Benjamin Hartwell was cut from the same cloth as his ancestors, and his approach was more sophisticated, but no less threatening than Margaret Caldwell's crude intimidation tactics. He began the conversation by praising Amanda's work ethic and expressing his appreciation for her years of service, but then he smoothly transitioned into what could only be described as an attempt at bribery disguised as generosity. "I've been thinking that perhaps it's time we recognized your loyalty more substantially," he said, sliding an envelope across his desk. "There's a check in there for $10,000, along with a reference letter that would help you find employment anywhere you might want to relocate." The implication was clear: take the money, leave town, and forget what you've discovered, or face the consequences of challenging people with the power to destroy your life. When Amanda refused the offer and made it clear she wasn't going to be bought off, Benjamin's mask of civility slipped, revealing the same cold calculation that had characterized his family's approach to acquiring other people's property. "You're making a mistake, Amanda," he said, his voice carrying the weight of generations of entitlement. "Some stones are better left unturned, especially by people who don't understand the complexities of business and law." The psychological warfare that followed Benjamin's failed bribery attempt was more subtle, but no less effective than the economic pressure Amanda had already been experiencing. She began noticing that people in town were treating her differently. Conversations would stop when she entered a room. Longtime acquaintances would avoid making eye contact, and she could feel the weight of whispered speculation following her wherever she went. Someone had clearly been spreading rumors about her mental state, suggesting that the stress of her recent financial difficulties had caused her to develop paranoid delusions about local history. The injusticia of being painted as unstable for seeking justice was almost unbearable, but Amanda recognized it as a classic tactic for discrediting someone who poses a threat to powerful people. They couldn't attack the evidence she'd gathered, so they were attacking her credibility instead, painting her as a desperate woman who'd lost touch with reality. The isolation was crushing. She'd always been a private person, but now that privacy felt like imprisonment as she realized how few people in her life she could trust with the truth she'd discovered. Even her own children were starting to express concern about her obsession with family history, worried that she was jeopardizing her financial security for the sake of events that had happened decades ago. The farce of community support that small towns are supposed to provide was revealed as another lie. When push came to shove, people would side with power over truth, with comfort over justice, with the status quo over the courage required to challenge it. As the pressure mounted from all directions, Amanda found herself facing the most difficult decision of her life: whether to continue fighting for justice despite the personal cost, or to accept defeat and try to rebuild the life that was being systematically destroyed around her. The evidence she'd gathered was solid, but evidence without allies is just paper, and she was learning that truth without power is often powerless against organized corruption. Her savings were dwindling as clients continued to disappear. Her social connections were being severed one by one, and the stress was taking a toll on her health and her relationships with her children. The people she was fighting had resources she couldn't match, connections she couldn't compete with, and a willingness to use tactics she'd never even considered. But every time she thought about giving up, she'd remember reading Catherine Hartwell's casual descriptions of destroying her family, and the rage would fuel her determination to keep fighting. The mentira that had shaped her understanding of her place in the world had been exposed, and she couldn't go back to living that lie even if it meant losing everything she'd built built on its foundation. What she needed was something she'd never had before. Allies who were willing to stand with her against the powerful families who controlled their town. People who valued truth more than comfort and justice more than security. The question was whether such people existed in Millbrook, or whether she was truly alone in her fight against a system that had been perfected over decades of crushing anyone who dared to challenge it. The breaking point came when Amanda realized that her investigation had put not just herself, but her children at risk, as the pressure campaign expanded to include subtle threats against David and Claire's employment prospects and social standing in the community. She'd been willing to sacrifice her own comfort for the sake of justice, but watching her children pay the price for her crusade forced her to confront the possibility that some battles can't be won by individuals acting alone, no matter how righteous their cause or how solid their evidence. The corruption she'd uncovered wasn't just about events from the 1960s, it was about a system of power that continued to operate in the present, protecting itself through intimidation, economic pressure, and social isolation of anyone who threatened to expose it. As she sat in her apartment, surrounded by the evidence that had cost her so much to gather, Amanda faced a choice that would define not just her own future, but the legacy she'd leave for her children. She could surrender to the forces arrayed against her, accept that some injustices are too big for ordinary people to challenge, and try to rebuild her life within the constraints imposed by those who held real power in their community. Or she could find a way to transform her individual struggle into something larger, something that might finally bring the truth to light and hold the powerful accountable for decades of theft and deception. The traceau she'd uncovered was still claiming new victims, still destroying lives, still protecting itself through the same tactics that had worked for generations. But Amanda Foster was about to discover that sometimes the most powerful weapon against organized corruption is the simple refusal to be silenced, even when silence seems like the only path to survival. You know how sometimes when you're drowning, help comes from the most unexpected places? That's exactly what happened to Amanda Foster when she made the decision that would either save her or destroy her completely. She decided to go public with what she'd discovered, consequences be damned. After weeks of being systematically isolated and intimidated, Amanda realized that fighting in the shadows was only making her more vulnerable to the powerful families who wanted her silenced. So she did something that terrified her, but felt like her only remaining option. She contacted Sarah Mitchell, a young journalist at the regional newspaper who'd been writing investigative pieces about corruption in small-town politics. Amanda's hands were shaking as she dialed the number, knowing that this phone call would cross a line she could never uncross, but also knowing that keeping silent was slowly killing her spirit and accomplishing nothing for the memory of her great-grandfather or the other families who'd been victimized. The farce of her quiet resistance had failed, so it was time to try a different approach, one that would either expose the truth to the light of day or result in her complete destruction. What she didn't expect was that her decision to seek help would reveal just how many other people in their community had been carrying similar burdens of knowledge and anger, waiting for someone brave enough to take the first step toward justice. The corruption she'd uncovered wasn't just her family's story, it was a wound that had been festering in their community for decades, and her courage to speak out was about to lance that wound and release all the poison that had been building up inside it. Sarah Mitchell turned out to be exactly what Amanda needed, a young woman with the idealism to care about historical injustice and the professional skills to do something meaningful about it. When Amanda first approached her with the story, Sarah was skeptical, as any good journalist should be when presented with claims of decades-old conspiracy involving some of the most respected families in the region. But as Amanda presented her evidence, the journal entries, the fraudulent documents, the pattern of property transfers, the testimonies from elderly residents, Sarah's skepticism transformed into the kind of focused intensity that comes from recognizing a story that could define a career. More importantly, Sarah had resources that Amanda lacked: access to additional records, connections with legal experts who could verify the authenticity of documents, and the protection that comes from working for a newspaper that, while small, was still part of a larger media network. The mentira that had protected the conspiracy for so long was about to face its greatest challenge yet: the scrutiny of someone trained to uncover truth and equipped with the tools to share that truth with a wider audience. What neither Amanda nor Sarah anticipated was how quickly their investigation would attract the attention of other journalists, legal experts, and activists who'd been waiting for exactly this kind of evidence to support their own suspicions about corruption in rural Tennessee politics. The story was bigger than just Millbrook, and the implications reached far beyond the specific families Amanda had been investigating. The response to Amanda's decision to go public was swift and came from directions she hadn't anticipated. Within days of her first meeting with Sarah Mitchell, Amanda received a phone call that would change everything. It was from Marcus Williams, a civil rights lawyer based based in Nashville who'd been tracking patterns of land theft targeting African American and poor white families throughout the South. Marcus had heard about Amanda's story through his network of contacts and wanted to meet with her immediately, explaining that what she'd discovered fit into a much larger pattern of systematic wealth transfer that had been occurring across multiple counties for decades. "You've found the smoking gun for something we've been investigating for years," Marcus told her during their first phone conversation, his excitement barely contained. "The families you're dealing with aren't just local criminals. They're part of a network that's been operating throughout this region, using the same tactics to steal land and destroy families for generations." The traceau Amanda had uncovered wasn't just about her family or even just about Millbrook. It was part of a systematic campaign of economic terrorism that had reshaped the entire social and economic landscape of rural Tennessee. Marcus brought resources that Amanda had never dreamed of having access to: a team of investigators, legal experts who specialized in historical fraud cases, and connections to federal agencies that might be interested in prosecuting crimes that had been protected by local corruption for decades. For the first time since she'd started this journey, Amanda felt like she wasn't fighting alone against impossible odds. The most surprising support came from within her own community, as Amanda's courage to speak out inspired other people to share their own stories of injustice and intimidation. Mrs. Eleanor Jackson, who'd initially been frightened about discussing her family's experiences, called Amanda to say she'd changed her mind and wanted to go on the record with everything she knew about the fraudulent foreclosures. Robert Williams decided to share documents his father had hidden away before his death, papers that proved the building code violations used to destroy his family's construction business had been fabricated. Even some younger residents of Millbrook began coming forward with stories about how their families had been systematically excluded from business opportunities, denied loans, or forced out of town when they'd tried to challenge the established power structure. The injusticia that Amanda had thought was ancient history turned out to be an ongoing reality that was still affecting people's lives in the present day. What had started as one woman's quest to understand her family's past was becoming a community-wide reckoning with decades of systematic oppression and theft. The farce of Millbrook as a peaceful small town where everyone knew their place was crumbling, as people began to understand that their place had been assigned to them by criminals who'd stolen their family's rightful inheritance. Amanda found herself at the center of a movement she'd never intended to start, but which felt like the natural result of finally telling the truth about what had really shaped their community's history. The reaction from her own family was more complicated than Amanda had expected, revealing divisions she hadn't anticipated and support from unexpected quarters. Her son David, who'd initially opposed her investigation as dangerous and pointless, began to change his mind as he saw the evidence she'd gathered and understood the implications for their family's future. "I always wondered why we struggled so much when other families seemed to have everything handed to them," he told Amanda during a conversation that brought tears to both their eyes. "Now I understand that it wasn't because we weren't good enough or smart enough. It was because the game was rigged against us from the beginning." Her daughter Claire became even more passionate about the cause than Amanda herself, using her skills with social media to document their family's story and connect with other families who'd experienced similar injustices. But the support wasn't universal. Some extended family members were angry about Amanda stirring up trouble and worried about the potential consequences of challenging such powerful families. The mentira that their family's struggles were due to personal failings rather than systematic oppression had been so deeply internalized that some relatives preferred to maintain that fiction rather than face the painful truth about what had really happened to them. Amanda realized that her fight for justice wasn't just against external enemies, but also against the psychological damage that decades of victim blaming had inflicted on her own family's sense of self-worth and possibility. As media attention grew and more evidence emerged, Amanda began to see cracks appearing in the facade of unity that had protected the conspiracy for so long. Some members of the families involved in the original crimes began distancing themselves from their relatives' actions, either out of genuine moral concern or simple self-preservation, as they realized the legal and social consequences that might be coming. Margaret Caldwell's own daughter publicly criticized her mother's response to Amanda's allegations, stating that, "If these accusations are true, then our family has a moral obligation to make things right, regardless of the legal statute of limitations." Benjamin Hartwell's younger brother, who'd always been the black sheep of the family, contacted Amanda's legal team to offer information about family documents that might support her case. The corruption that had seemed so monolithic and unbreakable was revealing itself to be more fragile than Amanda had imagined, held together by fear and habit rather than genuine loyalty or shared values. As cracks appeared in their unified front, the powerful families who'd seemed untouchable began making mistakes, threatening witnesses in ways that could be documented, attempting to destroy evidence in ways that could be proven, and generally behaving like people who knew they were guilty and were panicking panicking about being exposed. The traceone that had held their conspiracy together for decades was beginning to turn inward as self-interest overcame family loyalty, and the prospect of individual prosecution made people more willing to cooperate with investigators. Amanda watched with amazement as the system that had seemed so powerful and coordinated began to cannibalize itself, proving that even the most successful criminal enterprises eventually collapse under the weight of their own contradictions. The turning point came when Amanda realized that her individual story had become part of something much larger and more powerful than she'd ever imagined possible. A movement for justice that was attracting national attention and inspiring similar investigations in other communities across the South. Civil rights organizations, historical societies, and legal advocacy groups were rallying around her case as an example of how systematic oppression had operated and how it could finally be challenged and defeated. The evidence she'd gathered was being used to support federal legislation aimed at addressing historical land theft, and her story was being told in documentaries and academic papers that would ensure the truth about what had happened in Millbrook would never be forgotten or denied again. But perhaps most importantly, Amanda had discovered that she wasn't alone in her fight for justice. She was part of a community of people who'd been waiting for someone brave enough to take the first step and who were now ready to stand together against the forces that had oppressed them for so long. The farce of her powerlessness had been revealed as just another lie designed to keep her silent and compliant, and she was about to discover that the truth, when supported by courage and community, was more powerful than all the money and connections her enemies could muster. The question now wasn't whether justice would be served, but how complete that justice would be, and whether it would come in time to make a real difference in the lives of the people who'd suffered for so long under the weight of other people's lies and greed. You know how sometimes the most important revelations come from the people closest to you, the ones you thought you knew everything about. That's exactly what happened to Amanda Foster when she thought her fight for justice had reached its limits and the powerful families she was battling seemed to have endless resources to drag out legal proceedings and exhaust her will to continue. Just when the weight of the battle was becoming almost unbearable, when lawyers were warning her that proving decades-old fraud might be impossible without more concrete evidence, her 95-year-old grandmother Helen dropped a bombshell that would change everything. "There's something I never told you about what happened back then," Helen said during what Amanda thought was just a routine visit to check on her health. "Something I've been carrying for over 60 years, waiting for the right time to let it see the light." The farce that Amanda had been living her entire life was about to be completely shattered, not by more investigation or legal maneuvering, but by the revelation that the most important evidence had been literally buried in their own backyard all along. Helen's confession would prove that sometimes the truth doesn't just surface. Sometimes it's been carefully preserved by people who understood its importance, even when they were too afraid or powerless to use it. What her grandmother had hidden away wasn't just documents. It was the key to unlocking a conspiracy that had seemed untouchable and bringing justice to families who'd been waiting decades for someone to believe their stories. The story Helen told that afternoon was both heartbreaking and inspiring, revealing a level of courage and foresight that Amanda had never suspected her quiet grandmother possessed. "When they came for our land," Helen explained, her voice steady despite her advanced age, "your great-grandfather knew something wasn't right about those debt papers they were showing him. He'd kept meticulous records of all his business dealings, and he knew he didn't owe the money they claimed he owed." Helen described how her husband had suspected the documents were forged but had been powerless to prove it in a legal system that was clearly working against him. But he'd been smart enough to hide the original papers, the real contracts, the authentic financial records, the correspondence that proved the debt claims were fabricated, in a waterproof container that he'd buried beneath the old oak tree in what was then their backyard. "He made me promise to keep the secret until it was safe to tell it," Helen continued, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "He said someday someone in our family would be strong enough to use those papers to get justice, but it wasn't safe then because they would have killed him if they'd known he had evidence of what they were doing." The mentira that had shaped Amanda's understanding of her great-grandfather as a failed businessman was completely destroyed by this revelation. He hadn't been a failure at all, but a victim who'd been smart enough to preserve evidence of the crimes committed against him, even when he couldn't use that evidence to save his own property. The traceone that had seemed so complete and successful was about to be exposed by the very man who'd appeared to be its most helpless victim. The excavation of the buried documents felt like a sacred ritual, with Amanda, her children, and several members of their legal team gathered around the old oak tree that had somehow survived decades of development in what was now a small city park. Helen directed them to the exact spot where her husband had buried his evidence, and as as they carefully dug through layers of earth and time, Amanda felt like she was literally unearthing her family's stolen legacy. The waterproof container was exactly where Helen had said it would be, preserved by her great-grandfather's foresight and her grandmother's decades of patient waiting for the right moment to reveal its existence. Inside were documents that were even more damaging to the conspiracy than anything Amanda had found in Catherine Hartwell's diary. Original contracts that proved the debt claims were fabricated, correspondence between her great-grandfather and his lawyer showing his attempts to fight the fraudulent foreclosure, and most importantly, copies of the real financial records that proved he'd been current on all his legitimate debts at the time of the seizure. The injusticia that had seemed impossible to prove was suddenly documented in her great-grandfather's own handwriting, preserved by a man who'd understood that someday the truth would matter more than his own immediate safety. Marcus Williams, the civil rights lawyer, could barely contain his excitement as he examined the documents, explaining that this kind of contemporary evidence was exactly what they needed to build an ironclad case against the families who'd benefited from the original crimes. The corruption that had seemed so sophisticated and untouchable was about to be exposed by the simple honesty of a man who'd kept careful records and had the wisdom to hide them when honesty became dangerous. The impact of the newly discovered evidence was immediate and devastating to the families who'd built their empires on stolen foundations. Within days of the documents being authenticated by handwriting experts and historians, several members of the conspiracy families were reaching out through their lawyers to discuss potential settlements and mutually beneficial arrangements. The farce of their moral superiority and legitimate success crumbled in the face of irrefutable evidence that their wealth had been built on documented fraud and theft. Benjamin Hartwell, who'd been so arrogant and threatening during his attempts to buy Amanda's silence, was now desperately trying to distance himself from his family's crimes and offering substantial financial compensation to avoid criminal prosecution. Margaret Caldwell's real estate empire was facing federal investigation, and several properties that had been acquired through the fraudulent foreclosures were being seized as evidence in what was becoming a major federal case. The mentira that had protected these families for decades was collapsing so quickly that even Amanda was surprised by how rapidly their seemingly unshakable power was dissolving. Local officials who'd been complicit in covering up the crimes were scrambling to cooperate with federal investigators, and the network of corruption that had seemed so monolithic was revealing itself to be nothing more than a house of cards that collapsed the moment someone shined a bright enough light on its foundations. The traison that had held the conspiracy together was turning into a feeding frenzy, as former allies turned on each other in attempts to minimize their own legal exposure and save whatever they could from the wreckage of their criminal enterprise. The legal resolution came faster than anyone had expected, as the overwhelming evidence made it impossible for the defendants to mount any credible defense against the charges of historical fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy. The federal prosecutor assigned to the case described it as one of the most clear-cut examples of systematic land theft she'd ever encountered, with documentation that proved not just the original crimes, but decades of ongoing conspiracy to conceal those crimes and intimidate potential witnesses. Several of the original conspirators who were still alive were arrested and charged with federal crimes, while the estates of those who died were subject to civil forfeiture proceedings that would return stolen property to the families of their victims. The injustice that had seemed permanent and unchangeable was finally being addressed by a legal system that, when properly functioning, still had the power to hold even the most privileged criminals accountable for their actions. Amanda watched with amazement as properties that had been in the Hartwell, Caldwell, and Montgomery families for decades were transferred back to the descendants of their original owners, and as substantial financial settlements were awarded to families who'd suffered generations of poverty because of the original thefts. The corruption that had shaped the entire economic and social structure of Millbrook was being systematically dismantled, with new leadership emerging in local government and business as the old guard was either imprisoned or discredited beyond recovery. What had started as one woman's quest to understand her family's history had become a complete transformation of her community's power structure, proving that sometimes individual courage really can change the world when it's supported by truth and justice. The personal transformation that Amanda experienced was as profound as the social changes her courage had brought to Millbrook. The woman who'd spent 20 years accepting her place as invisible help to wealthy families had become a nationally recognized advocate for victims of historical injustice, invited to speak at conferences and consulted by other communities dealing with similar patterns of systematic oppression. Her children, who'd initially worried about the consequences of her investigation, were now proud to carry the Foster name and understood that their family's struggles hadn't been due to personal failings, but to criminal actions that had finally been exposed and punished. The farce of her powerlessness had been completely destroyed, replaced by a deep understanding of her own strength and the realization that ordinary people really can challenge and defeat even the most entrenched systems of corruption when they have the courage to speak truth to power. Helen, her grandmother, lived to see justice finally served, passing away peacefully just months after the legal proceedings concluded, having finally fulfilled her promise to her husband to keep their secret until it was safe to reveal it. The mentira that had defined Amanda's understanding of her family's place in the world had been replaced by a truth that was both painful and liberating. Painful because it revealed the extent of what had been stolen from them, but liberating because it proved they'd never been the failures they'd been made to believe they were. Amanda's story became a symbol of hope for other families dealing with historical injustices, proving that it's never too late to seek truth, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon against organized crime is simply the refusal to accept lies as truth. The legacy of Amanda Foster's fight for justice extended far beyond her own family's vindication, inspiring changes in laws and policies that would protect future generations from the kind of systematic theft and corruption that had shaped her community for decades. Federal legislation was passed requiring more rigorous oversight of property transfers in rural communities, and new legal mechanisms were created to help families recover from historical land theft, even when the original crimes had occurred decades earlier. The trace that had been so successful in Millbrook was exposed as a pattern that had been repeated throughout the South, leading to a broader reckoning with the systematic ways that wealth had been transferred from poor families to wealthy ones through corruption and fraud. Amanda's courage had lit a fire that spread far beyond Tennessee, inspiring similar investigations and legal actions in communities across the country where families had long suspected that their struggles weren't due to personal failings, but to systematic oppression that had never been properly addressed. The injustice that had seemed so permanent and unchangeable was revealed to be vulnerable to the simple power of truth, when that truth was supported by courage, community, and a legal system that still retained some capacity for actual justice. Amanda Foster, the invisible laundress who'd spent decades cleaning up other people's messes, had finally cleaned up the biggest mess of all, a conspiracy of lies and theft that had poisoned her community for generations. Her story proved that sometimes the most powerful people in society are actually the most vulnerable, because their power is built on lies that can be destroyed by anyone brave enough to tell the truth, no matter how long that truth has been buried or how many people have worked to keep it hidden. Amanda Foster's story proves that sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice isn't money, connections, or political influence. It's simply the courage to refuse to accept lies as truth, no matter how long those lies have been accepted by everyone around you. Her journey from invisible laundress to national symbol of resistance shows us that ordinary people really can challenge and defeat even the most entrenched systems of corruption when they're willing to risk everything for the sake of what's right. The betrayal that shaped her family for generations was finally exposed not because she had special powers or resources, but because she had something her enemies couldn't buy or steal, an unshakable commitment to truth and justice that proved stronger than all their threats and intimidation. Her victory wasn't just personal, it was a reminder that in a world where powerful people often seem untouchable, the simple act of refusing to be silenced can still change everything. What makes Amanda's story even more powerful is how it revealed that she was never really alone in her fight. She was part of a community of people who'd been waiting for someone brave enough to take the first step toward justice. Her courage inspired others to share their own stories, to stand up against the same forces that had oppressed them, and to believe that change was actually possible even when it seemed impossible. The corruption that had seemed so monolithic and unbreakable turned out to be vulnerable to the simple power of truth when that truth was supported by people who refused to be intimidated into silence. Her legacy extends far beyond her own family's vindication, creating new laws, inspiring other investigations, and proving that historical injustices don't have to remain buried forever if someone is willing to dig them up and demand accountability. The most beautiful part of Amanda's story is how it transformed not just her own understanding of her family's worth, but the entire community's understanding of what justice looks like when it's finally allowed to work the way it's supposed to. The lies that had protected criminals for decades crumbled in the face of evidence that had been preserved by people who understood that someday the truth would matter more than immediate safety. Her great-grandfather's wisdom in hiding those documents, her grandmother's patience in waiting for the right moment to reveal them, and Amanda's courage in using them to seek justice created a perfect storm that swept away generations of corruption and replaced it with something better. The farce of accepting injustice as inevitable was destroyed, replaced by the knowledge that ordinary people really do have the power to hold even the most privileged criminals accountable for their actions. This story shows us that what's hidden in the shadows always finds a way to come to light, and that truth, no matter how painful it might be, is what ultimately sets us free from the lies that keep us trapped in lives smaller than we deserve. If this made you think of someone who also needs needs to hear this message about the power of courage and truth, share this story with them. Sometimes the right message arrives at exactly the right moment to inspire someone to take that first brave step toward justice. And if Amanda's journey inspired you to believe that change is possible even when it seems impossible, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when they refuse to accept that injustice is just the way things have to be. Because the truth is, we all have more power than we realize. We just need the courage to use it.